He was painting the pavement of the neighboring mansion, without imagining that this gesture would change his life. By refusing payment with a sincere smile, he aroused the curiosity of the wealthy woman who watched him from the gate. Two opposite worlds met between notes, coffees, and silent embraces, challenging distrust and judgment. Before hearing this incredible story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more moving tales. The morning sun bathed the elegant streets of Chelsea, an upscale district of London, when Mark dipped his brush into the white paint for the first time that morning. His calloused hands held the tool with the precision of someone who had painted hundreds of pavements over the years. Sweat began to form small beads on his forehead, but he didn't stop. Every brushstroke was careful, meticulous, as if he were creating a work of art instead of just refreshing the curb in front of the imposing mansion. The house was different from all the others on the street. 3 stories of modern architecture, with large glass windows that reflected the blue sky, and a garden that looked straight out of a decor magazine. Mark knew that someone with a lot of money lived there, but that didn't intimidate him. Work was work, and he always did his best, regardless of the address. He wore his faded blue shirt, stained from so many renovations and paintings that it had lost its original color. His jeans had splashes of paint in various colors, like a map of the projects he had completed. His safety boots, worn but reliable, stepped firmly on the asphalt as he moved with the agility of someone who knew his trade well. From the other side of the elegant gate, Helen watched from a second-floor window. She had only arrived at that house, her latest acquisition 3 weeks prior, and was still getting used to the neighborhood's routine. She was a 42-year-old woman, accustomed to the fast pace of business, always wearing impeccable suits and carrying a packed schedule. But at that moment, something about the man's silent dedication as he painted her pavement made her pause. She descended the marble staircase, crossed the entrance hall decorated with expensive paintings, and opened the main door. The sound of her heels echoed through the garden as she approached the gate. Mark was so focused on his work that he didn't notice her until she cleared her throat delicately. "Good morning," Helen said, her voice carrying the refined accent of someone who frequented business meetings. "Excuse me for interrupting, but I need to know how much I owe for the service." Mark looked up, surprised. It was the first time he had seen the new resident up close. She was beautiful, with brown hair tied in an elegant bun and dark eyes that conveyed a natural seriousness. There was something in her posture that indicated authority, power. He stood up, wiped his hands on the cloth he carried in his pocket, and offered a shy smile. "Nothing, Mom," he replied simply, his voice hoarse but gentle. "It's just a neighborly kindness." Helen blinked, confused. No one did anything for free in her world. Every transaction had a price, every favor hid an interest. She studied the man's face, looking for signs of an ulterior motive, but found only honesty. "What do you mean, nothing?" she insisted. "You've been working for hours. You need to be compensated for your time." Mark shook his head, a smile still playing on the corner of his mouth. "No need, ma'am, I live there." He pointed to a simple house across the street, much smaller than the mansion, but well-maintained. "I like to keep the neighborhood beautiful. It's good for everyone." Helen followed his gaze and noticed the house for the first time. It was a modest, semi-detached house, painted light yellow, with a small front porch where 2 children's bicycles leaned against the wall. Colorful flowers adorned makeshift planters, and a clothesline stretched across the small side yard. It was the complete opposite of her mansion, but there was something welcoming about that place that she couldn't define. "Do you have children?" she asked, noticing the bicycles. Mark's face lit up immediately. "Yes, I do. 2. Lucas is 12, and Annie will be 7 next month." He spoke the names with an affection that was impossible not to notice. Helen nodded, still processing his refusal to accept payment. In her experience, everyone wanted something. Suppliers inflated prices when they discovered who she was. Friends appeared when they needed favors. Even past relationships had ended when she discovered that the interest was more in her assets than in herself. "Are you sure there's nothing I can do to thank you?" she tried once more. Mark dipped his brush into the paint again. "You already have, ma'am. You let me work in peace and were polite. That's already a lot." There was a simplicity in the answer that disarmed Helen completely. She remained silent for a few seconds, watching him resume his work. His movements were precise, professional. It was obvious that he knew what he was doing. "What's your profession?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Refrigeration technician," he replied without stopping painting. "I work for a company nearby, but on weekends I like to do odd jobs, small renovations, things like that. It helps supplement my income." Helen observed his hands as he worked. They were the hands of someone not afraid to get dirty, of someone who built things instead of just managing them. There were calluses on his fingertips and some small scars, marks of a life of manual labor. It was a total contrast with her own hands, always immaculate, protected by expensive creams and weekly manicures. "And your children? Are they in school?" "Yes, they are. Lucas is in middle school, and Annie just started first grade. She's super excited to have learned to write her own name," Mark said with evident paternal pride. "They are good children. They give me a lot of work, but they are my life." Helen noticed that he didn't mention a wife or partner. It was an observation she made unconsciously, but it caught her attention. In her experience, few people raised children alone by choice. A luxury car drove down the street, and Helen instinctively checked the time on her expensive watch. She had a teleconference in 15 minutes, but for some reason, she didn't feel like moving away from that simple conversation. "I need to go," she finally said, with an almost reluctant tone. "But thank you for the work. The pavement looks beautiful." Mark smiled again. "Don't mention it, ma'am. Have a good day." Helen returned home, but before closing the door, she looked back once more. Mark continued painting, completely absorbed in his work. There was something comforting in that silent dedication, something she hadn't experienced in a long time in her life, full of haste and pressures. During the teleconference that followed, Helen found herself looking out the window a few times, watching Mark finish his work. He carefully cleaned the brushes, collected the paint cans, and swept up the splashes that had fallen on the ground. When he finished, the pavement was impeccable, looking new. It was noon when Mark put away his tools and headed home. Helen watched as he opened the simple gate and went inside. A few minutes later, 2 children ran out of the house, clearly excited to see him. The smaller girl, who must have been Annie, jumped into his arms while the older boy, Lucas, walked beside them. Even from a distance, it was possible to see the genuine love that united them. Helen remained at the window even after they went inside. There was something about that family scene that stirred a pang of nostalgia for something she had never had. Her own house, despite all the luxury, was always silent, empty, echoing only the sounds of her own footsteps. That afternoon, while working on her financial reports, Helen found herself thinking about Mark's refusal to accept payment. In her corporate world, everything was a transaction, everything had a price. Disinterested kindness was such a rare currency that she had forgotten how it felt to receive it. When the sun began to set, Helen saw Mark go out again, this time wearing a clean shirt and carrying a toolbox. He was probably going to some night job. The children said goodbye at the door, and she noticed how Annie clung to his neck, reluctant to let him go. Lucas remained serious, as if carrying responsibilities beyond his age. Helen didn't know it yet, but that casual encounter on the pavement would be the beginning of a transformation that would completely change her perspective on what truly mattered in life. The simplicity of that "nothing, ma'am" had planted a seed of curiosity that would soon grow into something much larger and more significant than she could imagine. 3 days had passed since the pavement incident, when Helen found a small folded note under her gate. It was a school notebook page with a child's careful handwriting. "Thank you for letting my daddy paint your pavement. It looks very pretty. Annie." Helen smiled for the first time in weeks. There was something touching in the ingenuity of that thank you. Putting the note in her purse was an impulse she couldn't explain. All morning, while answering calls from investors and analyzing reports, her mind returned to those childish words. In the late afternoon, when she returned from the office, Helen saw Annie playing alone on Mark's front porch. The girl wore a somewhat faded yellow dress and had her brown hair tied in 2 braids. She was animatedly talking to a rag doll, creating elaborate stories aloud. Helen stopped her car in front of her house, but instead of going straight in, she crossed the street. Annie saw her approaching and her eyes widened in surprise. "Hello, Annie," Helen said, crouching down to be at the girl's height. "I received your note. That was very kind of you." Annie smiled, revealing a gap where she had recently lost a baby tooth. "Daddy said you were very polite to him. Mommy always taught us that we have to thank good people." The mention of the mother made Helen pause. She had noticed that Mark raised the children alone, but Annie spoke of her mother in the past tense, as if it were a distant memory. "Your doll is very beautiful," Helen said, delicately changing the subject. "What's her name?" "Rose," Annie replied, hugging the doll against her chest. "Daddy made her for me last year. He doesn't sew very well, but she's the most beautiful in the world." Helen observed the doll more closely. It was clearly handmade, with fabric scraps and mismatched buttons for eyes. Her hair was made of yellow yarn, a bit disheveled from use. It didn't have the perfection of the expensive toys Helen was used to seeing, but it was full of love and affection. "Your daddy seems very talented," Helen commented. "He fixes everything," Annie said with enthusiasm. "Refrigerator, air conditioner, blender. He even fixed the neighbor's television. And on Saturdays he makes pancakes for breakfast. Do you like pancakes?" The innocent question caught Helen off guard. When was the last time someone had cared about her culinary preferences? Her recent relationships involved dinners at expensive restaurants where conversations revolved around business and appearances. "Yes, I do," she replied honestly. "It's been a long time since I've had a homemade pancake." Annie seemed to consider this information seriously. "Next Saturday, Daddy will make them. If you want, you can come eat with us, but you have to arrive early because Lucas eats very fast." Helen laughed, a genuine laugh that surprised even herself. "I'll think about the invitation. That's very kind of you." At that moment, Lucas appeared at the door of the house. He was taller than Helen had imagined, with the serious face of someone who had matured prematurely. His eyes were like Mark's, but carried a distrust that didn't exist in his father. "Annie, come inside," Lucas said, his voice carrying a strange authority for a 12-year-old boy. "Daddy doesn't like you talking to strangers." Helen stood up slowly, understanding the protection the boy exerted over his sister. "You must be Lucas. I'm Helen, your neighbor." Lucas examined her from top to bottom, noticing the expensive car, the elegant clothes, the posture of someone accustomed to giving orders. "I know who you are," he simply said. "Annie, come on." The girl looked between her brother and Helen with a confused expression. "But she's nice, Lucas. She liked Rose." "Now, Annie," Lucas insisted, extending his hand to his sister. Helen wasn't offended by the boy's protective attitude. In fact, she admired his dedication to taking care of Annie. "It was a pleasure to meet you both," she said gently. "Annie, thank you for the note. It was the best gift I'd received in a long time." Annie smiled radiantly, but took her brother's hand obediently. As they entered the house, Helen heard Lucas's muffled voice. "You can't go telling just anyone about our lives, Annie." That night, Helen dined alone at her mahogany table, as she did every night. The meal was prepared by her housekeeper and served on expensive china, but it tasted of loneliness. She found herself thinking about the simplicity of the conversation with Annie, Lucas's fierce protection, and the notable absence of the children's mother. The next day, Helen woke up to an unusual noise outside. When she looked out the window, she saw Mark in the yard trying to fix what looked like an old washing machine. Lucas was beside him holding tools, while Annie played nearby with her doll. Helen observed the scene for a few minutes. There was something hypnotizing in the patience with which Mark explained each step of the repair to Lucas, transforming a household chore into a life lesson. The boy absorbed every piece of information with seriousness, clearly eager to learn and help. During the morning, while working at home, Helen continued to pay attention to the sounds coming from the neighboring house. Annie's laughter, Mark's calm voice explaining something, the clatter of tools. It was a symphony of family life that contrasted with the absolute silence of her own home. Around noon, Helen saw Mark head to her gate. He stopped hesitantly, as if deciding whether or not to bother her. Finally, he rang the doorbell. Helen opened the door personally, dismissing the housekeeper. Mark was there in his clean work shirt, but still carrying the tired expression of someone who had spent the morning battling broken equipment. "Sorry to bother you, Ms. Helen," he said, using her name for the first time. "It's just that my washing machine broke and I'll need to take the clothes to the laundromat. I saw that you have a big machine and I thought, well, if it's not too much trouble." Helen interrupted him before he finished. "Of course, you can bring the clothes whenever you want." Mark seemed relieved. "Thank you very much. I'll pay for the soap and electricity you use, don't worry." "No payment needed," Helen said, echoing his words from the day of the pavement. "It's just a neighborly kindness." Mark smiled, recognizing his own words. "Then it's settled. I'll go get the laundry." 15 minutes later, Mark returned carrying a wicker basket with laundered clothes. That needed ironing, and another basket with dirty clothes. Helen led him to her utility room, a space she rarely visited. "Wow," Mark said, looking around. "What a big machine. And that dryer must dry a whole family's worth at once." Helen laughed at the observation. "I think I bought everything too big for just one person. I never stopped to think about it." As Mark put the clothes in the machine, Helen noticed the simple quality of the garments. Well cared for children's clothes, but clearly passed down through generations. Work shirts mended with care. A small dress that must have been Annie's. There was love in every piece, even the humblest. "Your children must be a lot of work with clothes," Mark commented, observing Helen's impeccable wardrobe through the open bedroom door. "I don't have children," Helen replied simply. Mark stopped what he was doing and looked at her with surprise. "Sorry, I thought... Such a big house." Helen shook her head. "It's just me. Sometimes I think I bought this house too big. But at the time it seemed like a good investment." There was a melancholy in her voice that Mark immediately caught. He was good at reading people. He had to be to survive raising 2 children alone. "What do you do for work, ma'am?" he asked, trying to change to a lighter subject. "I manage properties," Helen replied, choosing a simplified version of the truth. "I own some buildings in the city." Mark nodded, clearly impressed. "You must be very intelligent to achieve such a position." Helen smiled sadly. If he knew that she not only managed, but owned dozens of properties, perhaps he wouldn't be so natural and kind with her. It was refreshing to be seen as an ordinary person, not as a walking check. "And you, sir? How did you start working with refrigeration?" Mark leaned against the wall as the machine started running. "My father was a technician too. I learned from him since I was little. When he died, I continued the work. It's not glamorous, but it's honest, and it allows me to be present for the children." Helen noticed that he avoided mentioning the children's mother again. There was a story there, but she didn't feel comfortable asking. "Lucas seems very responsible for his age," she commented. Mark's face clouded slightly. He had to grow up too fast. "Sometimes I worry that he feels too responsible for Annie, but he's a good boy, just a bit wary of new people." "It's understandable," Helen said gently. "He's protecting his family." Mark looked at her with gratitude. "Exactly. Many people don't understand that." They remained silent for a moment, listening to the comforting sound of the machine running. It was a domestic sound that Helen wasn't used to, but found surprisingly pleasant. "Can I make some coffee?" Helen offered. "I have a machine I never use properly." Mark smiled. "Yes, I'll accept. But let me make it. I bet I know how to handle machines better than you do, ma'am." Helen laughed. "You're probably right." As Mark prepared the coffee with a familiarity she envied, Helen wondered when was the last time someone had done something so simple and kind for her. In her world, people did favors expecting returns, but Mark seemed genuinely interested only in returning a kindness. The coffee was perfect, much better than any Helen had made in the expensive machine. They drank it sitting on the back porch, observing the quiet movement of the neighborhood at lunchtime. "Thank you very much for letting me use the machine," Mark said when he finished his coffee. "I'll be back in a few hours to pick up the clothes." Helen nodded. "Feel free. If I'm not home, the utility room key is under the pot there." Mark seemed surprised by the trust. "Are you sure?" Helen smiled. "I am. After all, you're a neighbor I can trust." When Mark left, Helen remained on the porch longer than usual. There was something comforting in the simplicity of that morning, in the naturalness of the conversation, in the shared coffee without pretensions. It was a striking contrast with her usual interactions, always calculated and formal. That afternoon, Helen found herself anxiously awaiting Mark's return to pick up the clothes. When he appeared, Annie came along, curious to see the neighbor's house. The girl was amazed by the size of the kitchen and asked if Helen cooked for many people. "Actually, I almost never cook," Helen admitted. "I don't know how to make many things." Annie seemed genuinely shocked. "Not even pancakes?" "Not even pancakes," Helen confirmed, laughing at the girl's incredulous expression. "Daddy can teach you," Annie offered immediately. "He makes the best pancakes in the world. And he also knows how to make chocolate cake." Mark smiled, a bit embarrassed. "Annie thinks I can cook because she's only eaten my food her whole life." "Is the invitation for Saturday pancakes still valid?" Helen asked impulsively. Annie clapped her hands, excited. "Yes, it is. You'll love them." Mark seemed surprised but happy with Helen's genuine interest. "If you really want to, it would be a pleasure to have you." Helen nodded, feeling an excitement she hadn't experienced in a long time. "Then I'll see you Saturday." When they left with the clean clothes, Helen remained at the door, watching Annie jump with joy as she told her father about all the details of the house she had seen. It was impossible not to smile at that childlike enthusiasm. For the first time in years, Helen was eager for a Saturday morning, not for a business meeting or a social event, but for homemade pancakes and the company of a family that had accepted her with simplicity and generosity. The week that followed passed with unusual slowness, each day seeming to last an eternity until the promised Saturday finally arrived. Saturday arrived with the kind of sunny morning that made children wake up early and birds sing louder than usual. Helen woke up before her alarm, something that hadn't happened in years. There was a pleasant anxiety in her stomach, as if she were a child waiting for a birthday party. She spent more time than usual choosing clothes, trying to find something that wasn't too formal for a family breakfast. After trying on 3 different outfits, she opted for light jeans and a simple blue blouse. When she looked in the mirror, she noticed she looked different. There was a lightness in her expression she hadn't seen in a long time. At 9 o'clock sharp, Helen crossed the street carrying a bag with fresh orange juice and fresh fruit she had bought especially for the occasion. The smell of pancakes already wafted from Mark's house, mixed with the aroma of fresh coffee that made her mouth water. Annie opened the door even before Helen rang the doorbell, as if she had been waiting behind the window. The girl wore a yellow Sunday dress with small embroidered flowers and had her hair tied with a matching ribbon. "You came!" Annie shouted, jumping with joy. "Daddy made extra batter because I said, 'You eat a lot.'" Helen laughed at the childlike honesty. "I hope I live up to expectations." Mark appeared at the kitchen door, wearing an apron that clearly belonged to a women's set. It must have been a souvenir from his ex-wife. He had flour on his hands and a welcoming smile on his face. "Welcome to our home," he said with genuine cordiality. "Sorry about the mess. Cooking with a 7-year-old helper always leaves everything a bit chaotic." Helen looked around the small but cozy living room. The sofa was made of simple fabric, but was covered by a colorful crocheted blanket. The walls had photographs of the children in inexpensive frames, but full of happy moments. A painted wooden shelf displayed children's books, some school notebooks, and organized toys. There was no luxury, but there was life in every corner. "It's not messy," Helen said sincerely. "It's alive." Lucas was sitting at the kitchen table, which was integrated into the living room. He looked up briefly when Helen entered, mumbled a polite but cold "good morning," and returned to focusing on the empty plate in front of him. His hands were restless, drumming on the wooden table, as if he was eager for that unusual situation to end soon. "Lucas, help put another plate on the table," Mark asked. The boy got up obediently and went to the cupboard, taking out a plate that, Helen noticed, didn't exactly match the others. They were mismatched pieces, probably acquired over time as needed, but everything was impeccably clean and cared for. Annie pulled Helen by the hand to a chair next to hers. "Sit here. That way you can help me cut my pancake. Daddy always cuts pieces too big." Helen sat down observing the family dynamic with fascination, Mark moved through the small kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had perfected every movement over the years. Lucas automatically filled a glass with juice for himself and another for Annie, but hesitated before serving Helen. "You can serve," Helen encouraged gently. "Thank you." Mark brought a stack of golden, warm pancakes, accompanied by honey, homemade strawberry jam, and butter. The aroma was irresistible, much better than any breakfast Helen had at five-star hotels during her business trips. "Wow, what a wonderful smell," Helen commented, and saw Annie's face light up with pride. "The recipe is from Daddy's grandma," Annie explained as Mark cut her pancake into small pieces. "She taught him when he was little like me." "Mummy knew how to make them too," Lucas added suddenly, his voice carrying a sadness that made the atmosphere tense for a moment. Mark stopped cutting and looked at his son with kindness. "That's true. Your mother made very good pancakes too." Helen realized that she had entered delicate territory. The mention of the children's mother brought a heavy atmosphere that she didn't know how to navigate. Annie seemed not to notice the tension, focused on spreading honey on her pancake. But Lucas became even quieter, stirring the food on his plate without eating. "These are delicious, Mark," Helen said, trying to lighten the mood. "You have a talent for cooking." Mark smiled, grateful for the change of subject. "I learned out of necessity. When you have 2 children to feed, you either learn fast or everyone goes hungry." "Daddy burned a lot of eggs at first," Annie recounted, laughing. "The house used to smell all of burnt egg, didn't it, Lucas?" Lucas gave a half smile, the first positive expression since Helen had arrived. "It was terrible. I even thought we'd have to eat burnt eggs for the rest of our lives." Mark pretended to be offended. "Hey, I've improved a lot since then. I don't even burn scrambled eggs anymore." The conversation flowed more naturally after that. Annie told stories from school. Mark shared anecdotes about funny clients at work, and even Lucas participated occasionally, though always observing Helen with caution. Helen found herself genuinely relaxed for the first time in months. There was no agenda to follow, emails to answer, or urgent decisions to make. There was just the simple pleasure of a shared meal and conversations without ulterior motives. "Helen, do you have siblings?" Annie asked suddenly. "No, I'm an only child," Helen replied, "and you're lucky to have each other." Annie nodded vigorously. "Lucas takes care of me when Daddy is working. He's the best brother in the world, even when he's mad at me." Helen looked at Lucas, who blushed slightly at his sister's compliment. "I imagine that's a big responsibility," she said gently. Lucas studied her for a moment before replying, "Someone has to take care of her." There was a premature maturity in that answer that broke Helen's heart. It was obvious that the boy had taken on responsibilities far beyond his age. After breakfast, Annie insisted on showing Helen her room, which she shared with her brother. It was a small but well-organized space. Annie's bed was covered with a faded pink quilt, and there were drawings taped to the wall above the headboard. Lucas's bed was impeccably made, and his schoolbooks stacked with military precision on a small desk. "This is my rock collection," Annie said proudly, showing a shoebox full of colorful pebbles she had found on the street. "And this is my favorite drawing. It's of our family." Helen looked at the drawing. There were 3 figures holding hands: a tall man, a small girl with braids, and a serious boy. There was no 4th female figure. "It's very beautiful," Helen said sincerely. "You look very happy in the drawing." Annie nodded. "We are happy. Daddy says family isn't about how many people there are, it's about how much love there is." Lucas, who had remained in the doorway, mumbled something about having homework and disappeared. Helen noticed that he became uncomfortable whenever the conversation approached family topics. Back in the living room, Helen helped Mark wash the dishes, insisting on contributing despite his protests. Working side by side at the small sink was strangely intimate and comfortable. "Thanks for coming," Mark said, as he dried a plate. "It's been a long time since we've had visitors." Annie was excited all week. "I'm the one who thanks you for the invitation," Helen replied. "It's been a long time since I've had such a delicious and familiar breakfast." Mark looked at her curiously. "Don't you have close family?" Helen shook her head. "My parents passed away a few years ago. I was an only child, as I said, and I never married or had children. It must be lonely sometimes," Mark commented gently. Helen stopped washing the glass in her hand. Sometimes I didn't even notice, she admitted. I was always so busy with work that I didn't stop to think about it. But today I realized what I was missing. There was a vulnerability in her voice that made Mark look at her more closely. He saw a successful, elegant, clearly prosperous woman, but now he also perceived the loneliness she carried. The children liked you, he said, Annie especially. She hasn't stopped talking about you since you met. And Lucas? Helen asked, curious about the opinion of the more reserved boy. Mark smiled. Lucas takes a long time to trust people. He hesitated before continuing. He's still hurt by some things that happened, but the fact that he participated in the conversation today is already progress. Helen nodded, understanding that there were complex stories behind that seemingly simple family. I'm not offended by his caution. In fact, I admire how he protects Annie. He had to grow up very fast, Mark said sadly. Sometimes I worry that he feels too responsible for everything. At that moment, Annie appeared in the kitchen carrying her doll Rose and a children's storybook. Helen, do you want to hear Daddy read? He does different voices for each character. Helen smiled. I'd love to. They settled on the sofa, Annie between Helen and Mark, with Lucas sitting in the armchair next to them, pretending he was just passing through the room, but clearly interested in the story. Mark began to read with enthusiasm, truly doing different voices for each character. Annie laughed delightedly, and even Lucas smiled a few times. Helen observed that scene with a pang in her chest. There was something deeply touching in the simplicity of that moment. Mark reading with dedication, Annie hanging on every word, Lucas trying to appear uninterested but clearly engaged. It was a family routine she had never experienced, neither as a child nor as an adult. When the story ended, Annie snuggled against Helen naturally. Can you come listen to stories another day too? Helen looked at Mark, who nodded with a smile. If I'm welcome, I'd love to. You'll always be welcome, Annie said categorically. Daddy, can she come for dinner one day too? Mark laughed at his daughter's determination. If Helen wants to, of course. I'd really like that, Helen replied, surprised by her own immediate response. Lucas stood up abruptly. I'm going to do my homework, he mumbled, and disappeared into his room. Annie seemed not to notice her brother's abrupt departure, but Helen and Mark exchanged a look of understanding. It was obvious that the boy still had reservations about this new friendship. Helen stayed another hour, helping Annie with a puzzle and talking to Mark about various topics. She discovered that he read a lot, despite his busy routine, and had interesting opinions on various subjects. He was a more cultured man than his simple clothes and manual profession suggested. When she finally said goodbye, Helen felt different. There was a lightness in her steps she hadn't experienced in years. The contrast between that family morning and her silent house had never been so evident. That night, while dining alone at her large table, Helen replayed every moment of the day. Annie's laughter, Lucas's protective caution, Mark's natural kindness. There was something about that family that attracted her like a magnet. For the first time, Helen began to question whether all the material possessions she had accumulated truly compensated for the absence of genuine human connections. The simple breakfast in the modest house had been infinitely more satisfying than any expensive meal she had recently had. It was the beginning of a transformation that Helen didn't yet fully understand, but that had already planted deep seeds in her heart. The question that wouldn't be silenced was, could it be that she, with all her wealth and success, was losing what truly mattered in life? In the next room, Lucas lay awake for a long time that night, thinking about the wealthy woman who had entered their lives. There was something about her that intrigued him, but his protective instinct still screamed warnings. After all, rich people always wanted something in return, didn't they? And he couldn't allow anything to hurt Annie or Daddy again. 2 weeks had passed since the pancake breakfast, and Helen had become a constant presence in Mark's family routine, not invasively, but naturally, like a piece that had found its place in the puzzle. She helped Annie with her homework when Mark came home late from work, lent books from her private library to Lucas, who she had discovered was a voracious reader, and occasionally brought special ingredients when Mark mentioned wanting to try a new recipe. That Tuesday morning, Helen noticed that Mark was different. He left home earlier than usual, with a worried expression she hadn't seen before. The children also noticed the change. Annie was clingier, as if sensing something was wrong, and Lucas adopted an even more protective stance than usual. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, Helen saw Mark arriving home. Even from a distance, it was possible to perceive the weight on his shoulders. He spent a few minutes sitting in the car before getting out, as if gathering strength to face the night. Helen waited an hour before crossing the street. She brought with her a Tupperware with lasagna she had prepared, one of the few things she could cook decently, thanks to cooking classes she had taken years before, but never used. Annie opened the door with a smile that couldn't completely hide her concern. "Hi, Helen. Daddy's a bit sad today." "That's why I brought dinner for you," Helen said gently. "Sometimes, when we're worried, it's good not to have to cook." Lucas appeared in the living room, observing the interaction. In recent days, he had started to slightly lower his guard, even going so far as to borrow an adventure book from Helen's library. But at that moment, his expression was again closed. Mark came from the kitchen, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Helen, what a pleasant surprise. Sorry, I wasn't expecting visitors." "I brought dinner," Helen said, showing the Tupperware. "I thought you might like lasagna." Mark seemed genuinely touched by the gesture. "It's very kind of you. To be honest, I wasn't in much mood to cook today." They settled at the small kitchen table, and Helen noticed that Mark ate mechanically, lost in thought. Annie chatted about school, trying to fill her father's unusual silence, while Lucas observed everything with sharp attention. "Daddy, didn't you like the lasagna?" Annie asked, noticing that he had only eaten a few bites. Mark blinked, coming out of his reverie. "No, my love, it's delicious. Daddy's just a bit worried about some things at work." Helen and Lucas exchanged a look. The boy clearly knew more than he let on, and Helen realized he was as worried as his father. After dinner, Annie went to take a bath, and Lucas retired to his room, claiming he had to study. Helen helped Mark wash the dishes, working in silence until he finally unburdened himself. "The company is going through difficulties," he said, without looking at her. "They lost some big contracts, and now they're cutting staff. My boss and Victor Miller. He's pressuring everyone to accept worse conditions. Less money, more hours, no overtime." Helen stopped drying the plate in her hands. "And you're thinking of accepting?" Mark sighed deeply. "I don't have a choice, do I? I have 2 children to support. I can't afford to be unemployed." "But you have qualifications, experience. Surely there are other companies." "It's not that simple," Mark interrupted, his voice laden with frustration. "I don't have a university degree, just vocational training. And the city isn't easy for anyone. Victor Miller knows that. He knows we have nowhere to go." Helen felt indignation growing within her. She knew this kind of exploitation well, had seen many owners take advantage of employees in vulnerable situations. But she couldn't reveal that she herself was on the other side of that equation. "How long do you have to decide?" "Until Friday," Mark replied. "If I don't accept the new conditions, he'll fire me. He said there's a line of people willing to work for less." At that moment, Lucas appeared in the kitchen asking for a glass of water. Helen noticed that he had heard part of the conversation by the way his shoulders stiffened. "Daddy, are you going to accept?" Lucas asked directly. Mark looked at his son, clearly not wanting to expose his worries to the child, but knowing Lucas was too mature to be fooled. "I'll think about the best option for our family," he replied diplomatically. Lucas nodded, but Helen saw the tears he was trying to hide. The boy quickly served himself water and returned to his room, leaving the adults in awkward silence. "He worries too much," Mark murmured. "Sometimes I forget he's still a child." Helen gently placed her hand on Mark's shoulder. "He loves you and wants to protect the family just like you do. It's natural for him to worry." Mark covered her hand with his, a simple gesture that made Helen's heart race. "Thank you for being here. I don't know what we did to deserve a friend like you. You welcomed me with open arms when I needed it most," Helen said honestly. "I'm the one who should be thanking you." They stayed like that for a moment, united by mutual concern. Helen desperately wanted to help, but knew that any direct offer of money would be misinterpreted and likely rejected. Mark was too proud to accept charity, and she respected that. The next morning, Helen woke up with an idea. She knew several companies in the city, many of them her tenants in her commercial buildings. Certainly some would need a qualified technician like Mark, but how to suggest it without revealing her connections? She decided to start subtly. During lunch, she went to Mark's house with the excuse of returning a book she had lent to Lucas. The children were at school, and Mark was taking advantage of lunchtime to fix a faucet that had started to leak. "How are things today?" Helen asked, watching him work. "The same," Mark replied without much enthusiasm. "Victor Miller called me this morning to remind me of the Friday deadline." Helen took a deep breath. "Mark, what if I knew of some job opportunities? Would you be interested in at least taking a look?" Mark stopped working and looked at her with curiosity. "What kind of opportunities?" "Well, I know some people in the city through my work, companies that might be needing qualified technicians." Mark considered the proposal for a moment. "I don't want you to feel obligated to help me, Helen." "It's not an obligation," she said quickly. "It's friendship, and besides, I'd just be passing on information. The rest would be up to you." Mark nodded slowly. "If you really know someone who's hiring, I'd be grateful for the information." Helen smiled, feeling more useful than she had felt in years. "I'll make some calls this afternoon." What Mark didn't know was that Helen wouldn't need to call acquaintances. She owned several commercial buildings in the city, and many of her tenants were companies that would certainly need refrigeration and maintenance services. The challenge would be to indicate these opportunities without revealing her true position. That afternoon, Helen called 3 of her tenant companies. For 2 of them, she mentioned that she knew an exceptional technician who was considering a job change. For the 3rd, a building maintenance company she knew was growing, she was more direct and asked if they would be interested in meeting a qualified professional. All 3 showed interest, especially when Helen briefly described Mark's qualifications. She scheduled interviews for the next day and Thursday, giving Mark options to consider before Victor Miller's ultimatum on Friday. When she told Mark the news that night, he was genuinely surprised and moved. 3 interviews in 2 days? How did you manage that?" Helen chose her words carefully. "I have some contacts in the real estate business. Many companies need reliable technicians for equipment maintenance, and your work has an excellent reputation in the neighborhood." Mark looked at her with admiration. "I don't know how to thank you. Seeing you and the children happy is repayment enough," Helen replied honestly. That night, Mark's house was celebrating. Annie had made a celebratory drawing of Daddy's new life, and even Lucas was visibly more relaxed. They invited Helen for dinner, and for the first time since they met, Mark was able to fully concentrate on the company, without financial worries weighing on his shoulders. "Tomorrow I'm going to the 2nd interview, but I don't even think I need to," Mark said as Helen helped clear the table after dinner. "Today's offer is so good it would be irresponsible not to accept." Helen nodded, but a part of her felt apprehensive. If Mark got the job, part of the stress that had brought the 2 of them closer would be resolved. She should have been completely happy, but she couldn't ignore the fear that, with his life stabilizing, perhaps she wouldn't be needed anymore. It was Friday morning when everything changed drastically. Helen was having coffee on her porch, watching Mark leave for work for the last time at Victor Miller's company, when a red imported car stopped in front of his house. It was an expensive model, which definitely didn't belong in that modest neighborhood. From the car emerged a blonde woman, elegantly dressed, wearing sunglasses even in the morning. Helen watched, intrigued, as the woman hesitated at Mark's gate. After a few minutes, she rang the doorbell. Annie appeared at the window, and Helen saw the girl's face change completely when she recognized who was outside. The girl ran inside the house, screaming something Helen couldn't hear from a distance, but the tone was of panic. Lucas appeared at the door almost immediately, and Helen saw his face harden when he saw the woman. Even from a distance, it was possible to perceive the tension in the conversation. The woman gestured a lot, as if arguing, while Lucas remained rigid in the doorway, clearly not allowing her to enter. Helen found herself holding the coffee cup so tightly that her fingers began to hurt. Intuitively, she knew she was witnessing something significant, and every protective instinct she had developed for the children was on alert. The discussion lasted about 15 minutes, during which Annie didn't appear again. Finally, the woman returned to her car and left, but not before leaving something in the mailbox. Lucas stood at the door for a long time after she left, as if processing what had just happened. Helen fought against the impulse to cross the street immediately. She didn't want to seem nosy, but worry was consuming her peace of mind. Finally, she decided she would make a casual visit later, perhaps bringing something for the children's lunch. Around noon, Helen crossed the street carrying sandwiches she had prepared. She rang the doorbell and waited, noticing that it took longer than usual for someone to answer. Lucas opened the door and Helen immediately noticed that he had cried. His eyes were red, and he avoided looking directly at her. "Hi, Lucas, I brought lunch for you," Helen said gently. "Where's Annie?" "In her room," Lucas murmured. "She doesn't want to come out." Helen entered and could feel the heavy atmosphere in the house. The joy of the previous night had completely vanished, replaced by a tension that was almost palpable. "Can I go up and see how she is?" Helen asked. Lucas hesitated, clearly torn between the protection he exerted over his sister and the need for support. Finally, he nodded. Helen went upstairs and found Annie curled, up in her bed, hugging her doll Rose tightly. The girl was crying softly, a sound that broke Helen's heart. "Hi, my dear," Helen said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "What happened?" Annie lifted her tear-stained face. "She came back," she simply said, as if that explained everything. Helen didn't need to ask who she was. "Your mother?" Annie nodded, sobbing. "She said she wants to take us with her. But I don't want to go. I want to stay with Daddy and with you." Helen's heart tightened at being included in Annie's list of important people. "And what did Lucas say to her? That she can't come in here, that she made us cry a lot when she left, and that she can't just come back like that?" Annie wiped her nose with her pajama sleeve. "But she said she's our mother and she has rights." Helen hugged Annie, feeling the girl calm down a little in her arms. "And you? How do you feel about it?" Annie was quiet for a moment before replying. "I missed her for a long time, but now I like our life. I like you being our friend, Daddy, making pancakes, Lucas helping me with homework, and she left when I needed her most." Helen felt tears forming in her own eyes. The premature maturity of that 7-year-old child was heartbreaking. "Annie, no matter what happens, I'll always be your friend." "That will never change," Helen said with conviction. Annie snuggled closer to her. "Promise?" "I promise." They went down to the living room together, where Lucas was sitting on the sofa, fiddling with his phone with nervous fingers. Helen realized he was trying to call someone. "Are you trying to talk to your father?" Helen asked. Lucas nodded. "But he's in a meeting at the new company. He can't answer." Helen sat next to him. "Do you want to tell me what your mother said?" Lucas looked at her with eyes still glistening. "She said she's living in a charming market town with a rich man who has a big house and can give us things Daddy can't." His voice was laden with anger and hurt. "She said she came to pick us up because now she has the means to raise us properly." "And you? How do you feel about it?" Lucas laughed bitterly, a frightening sound, coming from a 12-year-old boy. "What means? She abandoned us when Annie was 4, when Daddy most needed support, when things were hardest, and now that she's found a man with money, she wants to come back as if nothing happened?" Helen understood the depth of Lucas's resentment. He had taken on adult responsibilities to compensate for his mother's absence, had taken care of Annie when she was too young to understand why Mommy had left. His anger was justified and understandable. "Did she leave anything?" Helen asked, remembering having seen the woman put something in the mailbox. Lucas got up and brought an envelope. Inside were a letter and some photos. The photos showed a large house in a seaside town like Bournemouth, an expensive car, and the woman herself in expensive clothes next to an older man. Helen read the letter over Lucas's shoulder. Clara, that was her name, explained that she had grown and was now in a stable situation to give the children the life they deserved. She mentioned private school, trips, nice clothes. She said she would return at the end of the week for a definitive answer. She thinks we'll be impressed. With a big house and an expensive car, Lucas said scornfully. As if that's more important than everything Daddy did for us. Annie, who had been quiet during the reading, suddenly spoke. Helen, you have a big house and an expensive car too, but you don't think that's more important than affection. Annie's innocent observation made Helen shiver. The girl was right. Helen also had material wealth, but she had learned from that family that it meant nothing compared to genuine love. But what if Mark and the children found out how rich she really was? Would they react the same way they were reacting to Clara's promises? Would they also see Helen as someone who wanted to buy them? Do you think your father will let them go? Helen asked, trying to push away her own fears. Daddy will never let them, Lucas said with certainty. But she can go to court. She's the biological mother. Even though she abandoned us, she still has legal rights. Helen felt a cold dread in her stomach. She knew the legal system well enough to know Lucas was right. Biological mothers, even those who had abandoned their children, often obtained visitation, rights or even custody, especially if they could prove they now had better means of raising them. Let's wait for your father to arrive to talk about this, Helen said gently. You don't have to face this alone. Lucas looked at her with an expression she had never seen before. There was gratitude, but also something deeper. Will you stay on our side? Always, Helen replied without hesitation. Forever. They spent the rest of the afternoon trying to maintain a normal routine, but the tension was palpable. Annie clung to Helen as if fearing she too would disappear, and Lucas checked his phone obsessively, hoping Mark could answer. When Mark finally arrived home at 6 in the evening, radiant with the news about the job, he found a scene very different from the celebration he expected. The two children ran to him immediately, and Helen saw the exact moment he realized something was very wrong. What happened? Mark asked, hugging both children simultaneously. Clara was here, Lucas said directly, preferring not to prolong the agony. Helen saw all the color drain from Mark's face. He sat down slowly on the sofa, as if his legs could no longer support him, still with Annie clinging to his neck. What did she want? He asked in a hoarse voice. Helen remained silent, while Lucas recounted everything that had happened. Mark read Clara's letter twice, studied the photos with an indecipherable expression, and finally leaned back on the sofa with his eyes closed. Daddy, Annie called worriedly. Mark opened his eyes and looked at the two children, then at Helen. We'll face this together, he finally said. As we always face everything. Helen approached and placed her hand on Mark's shoulder. You're not alone, she said quietly. Mark covered her hand with his and nodded. But Helen could see the fear in his eyes. Clara had returned at the moment his life was finally stabilizing and brought with her a threat that could destroy everything they had built. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, Mark and Helen remained sitting on the porch processing the day's events. I always knew this day could come, Mark admitted. But I thought that if she wanted to come back, it would be because she had truly changed, not because she found a rich man. Helen observed him in profile, noting the tension in his jaw. What are you going to do? I'm going to fight, Mark simply said. Tooth and nail if necessary. These children are my life. I won't let someone take them from me just because they can offer material things. Helen nodded, but an inner voice whispered that perhaps she herself was a threat Mark didn't yet see. When he found out who she really was, would he see Helen the same way he saw Clara? As someone trying to buy his family's love? For now, she pushed those thoughts aside. Mark needed her, and the children too, later she would worry about the consequences of her secrets. Now all that mattered was protecting this family that had become more important to her than anything she owned. Saturday arrived laden with tension. Mark had spent the previous night on the phone with a lawyer a colleague had recommended, trying to understand his legal rights before Clara's return. Helen stayed at his house late, helping with the children and offering moral support, but both knew that the battle ahead would be difficult. Annie had woken up with nightmares twice during the night, and Lucas was more serious and protective than ever. Helen prepared a special breakfast for the family, trying to maintain some normalcy, but everyone ate mechanically, lost in thought. She said she would be back in the morning, Mark murmured, looking out the window at every passing car. "And we'll be ready," Helen said, holding his hand over the table. "You know what you feel, you know what you want. That's what matters." Lucas looked up. "What if she manages to take us anyway? What if the judge believes a big house is better than our family?" Mark turned to his son with determination. "That won't happen, Lucas. It might take time, it might be difficult, but I won't let them separate our family." It was noon when the red car stopped in front of the house again. But this time, Clara didn't come alone. An older man, wearing an expensive suit, got out of the passenger side. He had an air of authority and money, exactly the type of person who could intimidate in a legal dispute. Helen watched from the window as Mark took a deep breath, preparing for the confrontation. The children automatically positioned themselves close to their father, Lucas with a protective arm around Annie. The doorbell rang and Mark went to answer it. Helen stayed in the living room with the children, ready to intervene if necessary. "Mark," Clara said upon entering, her voice carrying a confidence that hadn't been there in the previous visit. "This is Peter Sallon, my fiancé. He has some things to clarify about the children's situation." Peter examined the house with critical eyes, clearly cataloguing every sign of financial simplicity. "Mr. Mark," he said formally, "I came to make a civilized proposal before we resort to legal means." Mark stood firm. "There's nothing to negotiate. These are my children." "Biologically, they are Clara's daughters too," Peter retorted. "And now she is in much better conditions to raise them. Private school, premium health insurance, educational trips, things that a refrigeration technician simply cannot offer." Helen felt her blood boil. She rose from the living room and positioned herself next to Mark. "And who are you to judge what a family can or cannot offer?" Peter looked her up and down, clearly unimpressed. "And you are?" "Helen," she replied firmly. "A family friend." Peter smiled condescendingly. "Friend? I see. Well, friend, when the courts analyze the comparative financial situation, I think it will be clear which environment offers better opportunities for the girls." At that moment, another car stopped in front of the house. Helen felt her stomach drop when she recognized who was getting out. It was Victor Miller, her property manager, someone who managed several of her properties. Victor Miller approached the house quickly, carrying a folder of documents. "Miss Helen," he called from the gate, "pardon me for interrupting on the weekend, but we have an emergency at the building on Elm Street. The commercial floor's refrigeration system has had a critical failure and needs immediate attention. The maintenance company said they need your authorization to—" The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes turned to Helen, but it was Mark's that haunted her most. There was confusion, then slow understanding, then something that looked like betrayal. "Your authorization?" Mark asked in a low voice. "For what?" Victor Miller, oblivious to the drama he had unleashed, continued, "For the emergency work at the building. Ma'am, as the owner of 32 commercial units in the city, you need to—" "Stop!" Helen said desperately, but it was too late. Peter laughed loudly. "How interesting. The family friend is actually a multi-property owner. How many buildings again, Mr. "Victor Miller," the manager replied automatically. 32 commercial and residential properties, one of the city's largest owners. Mark took a step back, as if Helen had just physically hit him. 32 properties. Helen tried to approach. "Mark, let me explain." "You let me talk about counting pennies to buy Annie trainers," Mark said, his voice growing in volume and hurt. "About worrying how to pay for their health insurance. About accepting humiliating work conditions because I couldn't afford to be unemployed." "It's not like that," Helen said desperately. "I never wanted to—" "Never." "Wanted what?" Mark shouted. "Never wanted to humiliate me? Never wanted to play at being ordinary when you could solve all my problems with a snap of your fingers?" Clara watched the scene with cruel interest. What a small world. It seems the children have two rich people vying for their attention. The difference is I'm honest about my circumstances. Lucas, who had remained silent until then, suddenly exploded. "You're a liar!" he shouted at Helen. "You pretended to be our friend when in reality you were just another rich person wanting to play with the poor." Lucas's words were like knives in Helen's heart. "No, Lucas, it's not like that. Then what is it? Annie asked, tears rolling down her face. Did you lie to us too? Helen knelt in front of Annie, trying to touch the girl's face, but Annie recoiled. Annie, darling, I never lied about how I feel about you. But you lied about who you are, Mark said with a broken voice. All this time you knew I was struggling with problems that would be insignificant to you. You saw me accept humiliation, saw my children worry if we'd have money for basic things, and you stayed silent. Because if I told you, you wouldn't have accepted me, Helen said, the words coming out in desperation. For the first time in my life, someone loved me without knowing how much I had in the bank. I wanted to preserve that. Preserve what? Mark laughed bitterly. Your fun, your social experiment. Playing at being poor must have been very exciting for someone who owns 32 properties. Peter watched everything with evident satisfaction. Well, that certainly changed the dynamic of the situation. Clara, it seems the children have been exposed to questionable influences. Victor Miller, finally realizing. He had caused a serious problem, tried to apologize. Miss Helen, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go away, Mark said to Helen, his voice cold as ice. Now. Helen felt as if her world had collapsed. Mark, please, let me explain. Explain what? That for weeks you watched me struggle with financial problems that you could have solved with what you spend on a single meal, that you let my 12-year-old son worry if we'd have money for food. I was helping, Helen said frantically. The job interviews, the support. You were buying preemptive forgiveness, Mark retorted, doing your little favors while hiding that you owned half the city. Lucas approached Helen, and she had hope for a moment that he would defend her. Instead, he said in a firm voice, You taught me to protect my family from people who want to use us. I never thought you would be one of them. Helen looked around the room. Mark watched her with scorn and hurt. Lucas was furious and felt betrayed. Annie cried in confusion, not fully understanding what was happening, but feeling that her world had shattered. Clara and Peter watched with thinly veiled satisfaction. I never wanted to use you, Helen said in a last attempt. I love you. Love isn't built on lies, Mark finally said. Go away, Helen, please. Helen nodded, tears finally overcoming her composure. She headed for the door, stopping only to look one last time at Annie, who was hiding behind Mark. Annie, she said softly, remember when you asked if I was leaving? I promised I wouldn't. And I was telling the truth about my feelings, even if I didn't tell the truth about other things. Annie didn't answer, just clung tighter to her father's leg. Helen left, the house feeling as if she were in a nightmare. She crossed the street to her own house, which suddenly seemed monstrously large and empty. Behind her, she could hear Clara beginning to present her arguments to the children, taking advantage of the emotional turmoil the revelation had caused. Sitting alone in her luxurious living room, Helen finally understood the cruel irony of the situation. She had spent her entire life accumulating wealth and properties, thinking that this would give her security and happiness. But it was only when she found a simple family who loved her thinking she was ordinary like them that she discovered what truly mattered. And now, because of that very wealth, she had lost the only thing that truly meant anything. From across the street, she could see through the windows the silhouettes of Mark and the children listening to Clara. Helen wondered if her unintentional betrayal had just delivered the children exactly into the situation she had tried to protect them from. For the first time in her adult life, Helen cried for something money couldn't buy back, the trust and love of the only family that had truly mattered. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Mark, Helen, Annie, and Lucas has touched your hearts as much as it has touched ours. This journey reminds us that true love is priceless, and that family is built with daily choices of steadfastness and affection. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more tales that explore the complexity of human relationships. Leave a like if the story resonated with you, and share in the comments. Do you believe true love can overcome any social difference? Your personal stories are also welcome. Sometimes real life surpasses any fiction. Don't miss our next content, where we will continue exploring the bonds that truly matter. Until the next story.